Our second speaker for today is Seth Lowe. And Seth is an English major here at Rowan. He's also in our ethics minor, and he has a second minor in human resource management. That's a lot. Okay. And Seth is going to present a paper entitled Existentialist Responsibility and Nichomachean Responses to Racial Inequality in American Educational Institutions. So join me in welcoming Seth.
So in January, I wrote an op-ed for The Wit regarding collegiate education's failure to include critical race theory into courses for education majors. I sent it to the New York Times, but shockingly, they had more important things to publish. So this is kind of the theoretical framework that I based it on. Systemized racial inequality persists despite growing cultural consensus regarding its immorality. Critical race theory, or as I'll refer to it throughout, CRT, has become an integral vehicle in efforts towards challenging and disempowering systemic racism, but its presence on K-12 curricula has resulted in widespread national controversy. I argued that requiring critical race theory to be taught in tertiary educational institutions, specifically for aspiring educators, is ethically grounded as the morally right action according to existentialist ethics. Furthermore, Aristotle's Nichomachean ethics of virtue provides an avenue through which we might prepare future educators to resist the existing racist structures and ideologies they'll encounter. If systemic racism is understood as a social process perpetuated by actively repeated behaviors, and we acknowledge that educational institutions and policies have historically operated as apparatuses of oppression, then we have a moral obligation to resist and dismantle the existing forces that infringe upon the absolute freedom of others. Requiring collegiate education departments mandate courses specifically aimed at teaching CRT to future educators serves as the first step towards dismantling these processes as we as a society attempt to provide aspiring educators with Aristotelian moral experiential learning in an effort to prepare them for resisting systemic racism in their future roles. In the unabridged version of this argument, I explored several definitions of systemic racism and structural inequality at length. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm primarily going to focus on the conception of covert racism presented by Kwame Ture and Charles V. Hamilton. In Black Power, Politics of Liberation, Ture and Hamilton posit that covert racism originates in the operation of established and respected forces in society. Whereas overt racism might take the form of derogatory insults or blatant explicitations of white supremacy, covert racism occurs within pre-empowered societal apparatuses, such as educational institutions, legislative offices, and philanthropic foundations. Since these forces are already empowered by public confidence, the discrimination they enact is more difficult to address and disrupt. Historically, educational institutes have served to uphold racial inequality. Although education is often alleged to be apolitical, lest it veer towards indoctrination, education as an institute is fundamentally political. Course materials and curriculums both reflect and produce cultural ideologies. Political institutions and their constituents determine what material will be covered, and the covered material goes on to shape the beliefs and actions of students. This cycle necessarily privileges some information. Unfortunately, despite the seemingly politically neutral intent of education, discursively accepted course materials have come to reflect racist ideologies that further marginalize minorities and reproduce the racist discourse necessary to maintain racial inequality. However, it's important to acknowledge that while these institutions serve as vehicles for racial discrimination, the institutions are composed of individual participation. An institution may be liable for perpetuating racism, but the institution can't be some sacrificial scapegoat for us to blame. Rather, the individuals making up that institution are responsible for any racist byproducts. In Resistance as Sacrifice Towards an Ascetic Anti-Racism, Musa al-Gharbi explains that systemic racism is a function of behavioral patterns that systematically advantage some and disadvantage others. It persists because it is enacted moment to moment, situation to situation. Although it's easy to point fingers at institutions, acknowledging individual participation is necessary in order to progress towards an anti-racist future. The larger system of education may be guilty of upholding systemic racism, but the actions of individuals in schools are responsible for the presence of racist course materials and discriminatory educational practices. Existential ethics promote a similar understanding of responsibility. As Jean-Paul Sartre infamously stated, man is condemned to be free because once thrown into the world, he's responsible for everything he does. The individual is overwhelmingly, unavoidably accountable for their actions. In a world of absolute freedom proposed by existentialists, we can't escape our responsibility, nor can we blame it on institutions without living in bad faith. Man, not the institution under which man operates, is guilty of maintaining systemic racism. Teachers, administrators, and educational legislators are all guilty of sustaining racial inequality within American education. In regards to the ethicality of education's participation in upholding racial inequality, it's a mouthful, I'm surprised I got through all those itties. Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity provides a platform for sharp criticism of this enduring behavior as morally wrong. Existentialist ethics proposes a revolutionary freedom in which we're unrestrained in our actions and resultantly responsible for everything we do. However, that freedom is intrinsically connected to the freedom of others. De Beauvoir argues that to will oneself free is also to will others free, and that one's freedom can only be achieved through the freedom of others. If we are to maintain our own inherent freedom, then we're obligated to protect the freedom of others. Infringement on anyone's freedom is a threat to the freedom of everyone. Racist ideologies introduced through educational systems threaten the freedom of those already marginalized groups. The teaching of these oppressive beliefs has very practical, dangerous implications. While discriminatory beliefs continue to be taught, bigoted students become oppressive cultural participants and leaders. Failing to remove these damaging ideologies from classrooms allows systemic racism to continue its dangerous existence. If an individual cannot fully participate in society, they can't be free. Since systemic racism restricts that absolute freedom for people of color, existentialist ethics suggests we have an obligation to counteract this infringement in order to protect and maintain the freedom of everyone. If systemic racism is intrinsically connected to America's educational institutions, great strides must be taken to resist and disarm the racist ideologies present. Critical race theory aims to accomplish this by bringing awareness to racism's prevalence in society. Despite having emerged initially as a legal theory, CRT challenges society to acknowledge the role of race in generating societal hierarchy and institutional systems of marginalization. The first necessary step to eradicate the racist structures of American education is to teach future educators about racism's prominence in these institutions. By doing so, we can arm them with tools to resist and reduce systemic racism in their future careers. Currently, no institutions of higher education in New Jersey have adopted CRT as a required subject of study. Although several schools, including Rowan, have made commitments to developing a more diverse teacher workforce, the curricula failed to recognize the history and contemporary reality of racist ideologies in the classroom. Failing to incorporate CRT-focused curricular requirements, specifically for future educators, fails to protect the infringed upon freedom of those who have suffered from the teaching of these ideologies. As a result of this oversight, educational institutions continue to be complicit in allowing racism's continued existence in American education. Rectifying this moral failing is essential in order to destabilize and resist systemic racism, and Aristotle's virtue ethics provide a solution. In his Nichomachean Ethics, Aristotle proposed an experiential method of perfecting moral ability that involves repeatedly practicing moral behaviors. It advocates for a kinetics-based, hands-on approach to morality because he believed moral learning and a mastery resulted from actually practicing that desired behavior. For the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. If one wants to improve their morality, they must exercise it before mastering it. Future educators will inevitably encounter the same racist hierarchies and ideologies upheld within educational institutions. Arming them with skills, abilities, and opportunities to practice using these moral skills prior to entering the career field will prepare them to actively resist and reform racial inequality. Any hope of removing racism from education requires moral practitioners of justice that are willing and able to battle an institution fraught with racist practices and fundamentally built on a racist history. Preparing them to thwart the immorality of educational racism through practice, as proposed by Aristotle, will allow them to master the moral aspects and practical actions necessary to effectively remove racism from educational institutions. Systemic racism has plagued America since its inception, and educational institutions have served as an ideological vehicle used to maintain its racial inequality. From an existentialist perspective of absolute freedom, we have an ethical obligation to protect the freedom of others. The marginalization and oppression of systemic racism endangers the freedom of already marginalized groups, and an existentialist understanding then suggests that we must use our freedom to resist the restriction of freedom imposed upon others. By recognizing that the American education system has participated in promoting racial inequality, we must then resist and reconcile that oppression in order to protect this threatened freedom and act in the morally right way. Teaching CRT to aspiring educators serves as a method of resisting marginalization. preparing them to destabilize the generally accepted ideologies that have worked to promote racist beliefs and maintain racial inequality. Furthermore, teaching future educators with CRT-focused curricula provides experiential moral learning opportunities that align with Aristotle's philosophy. By allowing students to practice their moral skills in the classroom, by learning about education's historical complicity in systemic racism, and arming them with anti-racist ideologies and practices, we'll take the first step in fulfilling our moral obligation. Although systemic racism is a nuanced, layered societal epidemic, raising awareness for aspiring educators about ways they might unconsciously be complicit in promoting racist ideas and preparing them to resist racism in the educational sector provides a method to repair and reform educational institutions from further perpetuating systemic racism and limit any more marginalization. Thank you.